Welcome to something of a first for this channel. Today I'm very pleased to have with me a guest co-presenter, Dr. David.Scott of the Open University. Together we have spent 3.5 years investigating many different aspects of the East Lancashire's Weavers' Uprising of 1826. We're looking at everything from parish registers, thousands and thousands of records, and thousands of words of transcribed contemporary newspaper articles, all on microfilm. Also piecing together the family trees of the people involved. And as a result of doing all this research, we have ended up with enough research to write a book. There is more than enough material there. The book will be called Rise Up, as you may be able to see from the banner here, and we're now in the process of co-writing it. The bicentenary of the Weavers' Uprising will fall in late April 2026, so it's only a few months away. And in the next few months we know that a lot of interest in details of the events will be building up. In fact, it's already building up now. This video is intended to be a taster of the contents of Chapter 8 of Rise Up, which references some of the witness statements originally given in the aftermath of the Chatterton Massacre. Some of what we're about to talk about never actually made it into Lancashire's newspapers back in 1826.
As Kate has mentioned, we're going to be focusing in this short video on Chapter 8 of the Rise Up book, Chatterton, the Truth. This explores the complex search for historical truth surrounding the 1826 Chatterton Massacre, in particular focusing on the inquest evidence that was given in April and May 1826. We focus in particular on the central role of James Watkins in shaping the evidence that was delivered at the inquest. We also consider some of the legal depositions and the influence of the witness statements, often provided by those who were actually closely aligned to the mill owners or by mill owners themselves, and the selective presentation of the inquest evidence. And alongside that, we also point to how the army themselves hindered further investigation into the soldiers responsible for the death of James Watkins. Through considering the different narratives, the different voices, the different testimonies, and particularly those shaped by James Watkins, the chapter in the Rise Up book starts to actually underplay and underscore how the protestors were conceived as culpable, when in actual fact the story is much more complicated, and we see how there seems to be a shift in the inquest as they developed towards actually trying to present a greater justification for the military's actions. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is to call for the greater scrutiny and reflection upon the actual voices that were heard through the inquest itself.
In particular, we are going to explore efforts to uncover and challenge the suppression of working class protests at Chatterton, focusing on the ways the truth has been concealed by people with powerful interests. It highlights the inconsistencies in historical accounts, the influence of researchers and historians when they've interpreted the events, and the problematic nature of witness testimonies, especially those which were collected for legal or political purposes. The importance of critically analysing these to see who provides evidence and for what reasons is emphasised to better understand the complexity surrounding these historical injustices. We will briefly review 4 aspects of the chapter in this video. the contradictory evidence in the legal depositions, the early inquest evidence, the evidence following the intervention of James Watkins, and then we're going to look at 10 ways in which the truth at Chatterton has been covered up. There are several powerful testimonies about the Chatterton massacre. John Ratcliffe provided eyewitness accounts of the chaos and tension of the protest, including requests for money and food, and an overall atmosphere of fear and alarm. Some of the testimonies, though, are questionable. John Rostron certainly gives controversial evidence about Mary Simpson. According to him,
Simpson, the woman who was killed at Mr. Aitken Mills, say, "The dressing machines are not broken. They are in the top garret," or words to that effect, and swearing very much.
His brother Lawrence Rostron had this to say.
On getting to the landing in the second story, which is the entrance to the mill, informant heard the woman and the name of Simpson, who was afterward killed at Mr. Aitken's mill, say, "Damn you lads, why don't you go up and break the dressing machines? They are at this far end of the garret, you soft devils," or to that effect.
And then later in his testimony,
and that informant did by the former manoeuvre of giving money to some of the rioters when the woman Simpson was encouraging the mob to go forward to break the dressing machines by calling out, "All the dressing machines are broken," saved property to the amount of from £1,500 to £2,000.
but the richness of the accounts of the Chatterton massacre go beyond the legal depositions. There's also extensive evidence from the inquest. It's important though to consider this inquest evidence in two parts. The early evidence given at the inquest is very critical of the actions of the soldiers. Let us reflect here on the testimony of John Platt before the coroner, Mr. Ferrand, on the 28th of April 1826.
Saith, then the firing seemed to ease for a few minutes, and witness heard that they had broken the door of his daughter's house open, and he went and found some strangers in, and a lad, a thin poor lad of about 15-year-old, who complained of his belly, and he desired the daughter of the witness to pull the clothes out of the hole which was where in his belly, and his daughter, to please him, tried and found that there was indeed a hole as deep as she could put her finger in. And the witness got all the people out but one, and made the door fast, and in about 10 minutes he heard a shot in front of the house, within 2 or 3 yards of it. And in a few seconds his daughter looked out the window, and she saw Wattiker lying at the door. And in a few moments some 4 or 5 of the rifle corps came to the door, and seeing Wattiker lying there, they said, "You are foxing it," and they tried to open the door but could not. They then broke the window with their guns, and some of them fired into the house. They did so several times, and they saw witness and his daughter, and swore they would shoot them, and kept calling for them to open the door, and the witness said they could not, for it was nailed up, and the witness desired the soldiers to push at it, and they did. And the witness and his daughter helped them, and they got the door open. Then 4 or 5 soldiers came in and they immediately seized the witness and put the guns to his belly and swore they would shoot him. The witness begged for his life and told them he was there to protect his daughter who lived there. And at last they believed him. Then they heard somebody upstairs, and some of them went up, and in a short time he heard they were very rough. And he went up the stairs and found one of them having hold of his daughter Alice, and another holding Mary Whitaker, and swearing they would shoot them. And then the soldiers, they said where they lived and where they worked at the mill, and the witness confirmed the report. And then they found a boy under the bed, and they pulled him out, and the witness told them that he worked at the mill, but they pushed him out and they left the house.
Remarkably, we also have complementary evidence from John Platt's daughter, Betty Upton, a young widow. Saith Mr. Aikins was all the time exceedingly alarmed, and he put his head out of the window and spoke, saying, "I would rather have all my property destroyed than any life should be lost." Saith after a little time she heard they had taken a dead man into her house, and she went to see and found the door had been broken open, and there was a youth who appeared hurt, and several others whom she did not know in her house. And the lad had begged her to help him by trying to pull the ball out of his belly where it had entered by putting her fingers in. And then she, by a pair of scissors, and to please him, she tried but could feel nothing. He desired a doctor to be sent for, saying his parents could pay for one. Thomas Schofield, the constable, came, and he and some other men got a door and carried him away upon it. And 2 other men took the boy out of her house, and then she had her door made fast, and she soon heard a fire close to her house, and also smelt the powder, and heard a person make a moan and something fall close to her door, and she looked out of the chamber window, and saw James Whitaker lying at her door. Saith she went downstairs directly, and by the time she had got there were several of the soldiers in green trying to force her door, and she heard one of them say, "Here he lies, damn him, he is foxing, run through." And she heard James Whitaker answer he was not, he was shot and wanted to go into Betty Upton's. Saith at the same moment her window was broken by the ends of their guns, and she heard one of them say he had seen a woman, and they fired their guns into her house. Saith she remained in the stairs out of the way of harm, as she thought, and in a little time they said again they had seen a woman. And they fired again, and by a witness begged for her life and called out that she was only a widow and lived there, and they told her she was one of the rioters, and demanded the door to be opened, and witness said she could not open it, and her father came to her assistance, and they both said if the soldiers on the outside would push, they would pull and help them, and they did so, and then it was broke open, and when the soldiers got in, they were very rough and threatened to destroy them and challenged her father with being a rioter. And he, witness, told them who he was, and they were so violent and witness so frightened that witness took one of the soldiers around the neck and begged of him to spare their lives. And then the soldiers heard somebody upstairs, which were her 2 sisters, and Thomas Coop, a neighbour, who had come in to help them fasten the door. And witness stuck to the soldier, clinging round his neck to prevent him going upstairs. And he was going upstairs, and he promised her he would not hurt her. He went upstairs, and so did 2 other soldiers, or more, witness cannot tell how many. And they laid hold of Thomas Coop, and were kicking him sadly. And he told them who he was, and what he was, and that he had gone in to help to make up the door. And witness said the same. And they kicked him down the stairs, and 2 of them had hold of her sister, and they pointed their guns at her belly, and swearing they would blow her brains out. And she kept telling them she lived there, and worked for Mr. Aitken. And in some time they were more quiet, and said they would blow their brains out if they thought they were among the rioters.
The chapter then explores how there are significant differences between the evidence brought between the different people at the inquest, notably between Thomas Ferrand, the coroner, and James Watkins, JP, Justice of the Peace. We've already heard the testimonies of John Platt and Betty Upton. They were brought before Thomas Ferrand, the coroner. However, there was then an adjournment of the inquest, and other evidence was then brought before Justice of the Peace, James Watkins. Whereas much of the early testimonies to the inquest, as we have heard, were highly critical and given to Ferrand directly, later evidence was brought before JP Watkins, and a very different kind of tale is told. The tone and focus of the inquest evidence changes considerably. We think that this might have been because there was a danger that some of the soldiers may have been open to prosecution because of the lack of evidence around necessity for the actual actions that they undertook. In particular, we think that this was the case when it came to the deaths of Mary Simpson and also to James Whittaker. And if you note from the evidence that were presented so far in this video, there was clear negative reputations told about Mary Simpson by the Royston brothers, and also the kind of evidence that was presented about Whittaker's death by Platt and Upton was extremely critical of what the soldiers did, and we think that might actually have left the soldiers open to prosecution. When the evidence was actually retaken with people such as Levinas Jones, Colonel James Kearney and Thomas Aitken, a very different story started to emerge.
The chapter also reflects upon 10 ways in which the historical truth of Chatterton was suppressed. Number 1. By referring to the massacre as a riot. One obvious attempt by authorities and the media to deny the truth of what happened at Chatterton on the 26th of April 1826 was to refer to it as a riot. At various places in the Rise Up book and in earlier videos, this occurs, but it is worth re-emphasising how the language of riot never indicates that people died and places the blame on the protesters. Point 2. Referring to the massacre as a fight. A very similar point can be made about referring to the events as a fight or an affray. This implies that both sides were relatively equal in terms of potential harm to each other, when in reality the soldiers and cavalry had guns, sabres and bayonets, whilst the protesters were largely unarmed. 3 soldiers were reported to have minor injuries. At least 6 protesters were shot dead, and the number of wounded or those who later died of their wounds is simply unknown.
3. False evidence in the legal depositions. We believe that there were certain elements presented in the legal depositions which do not necessarily add up or reflect the truth of what happened during the rising or what happened at Chatterton on the 26th of April 1826. We are particularly concerned here with the evidence we cited earlier from the Royston brothers on Mary Simpson. Simpson had merely missed her coach. She was a bystander. But there seems to have been lies told and negative reputations spread to remove the fact that she had no involvement in the protests. She would not, as we can see from the evidence presented by the Roystons, she would not have known exactly where the actual the power looms were held in their mill in Edenfield, and yet that's exactly the evidence that they present in their testimonies and legal depositions. 4. Restricting access to the press at the inquest. The failure to make the inquest testimonies open to the media may well have reflected the chaotic nature of what happened and the desire to, at least at first, contain the narrative of what had occurred. As it turns out, newspaper reports, for example, the testimony or extracts or summaries of the testimonies of people like John Platt, were leaked to the press in 1826 and they were widely published. But it was clearly an attempt to prevent public access to the truth at the inquest itself.
Number 5. Limited number of witnesses to the first few deaths. The small number of witnesses to the inquest for the first 5 deaths also indicates a reluctance to investigate this in any real depth. Yes, there were more than 100 legal depositions taken, but they are not the same as the institutional process established to uncover the truth. In other words, the legal inquest.
6. James Watkins JP and the witness testimonies. This is something that we've already explored with you earlier in this little film. But we just want to go over that again in the sense that this was a really, really important aspect of how the truth was ultimately, we think, covered up at the Chatterton Massacre. So we think that the role of James Watkins, JP, in marshalling the evidence was key in terms of how the story was unfolding and told later and at the time of the Chatterton events. Prior to Watkins' interventions, during and after the adjournment, the narrative and the evidence changed. Prior to Watkins' interventions, the chaotic and violent nature and the actions of the soldiers was emphasised, and how shocked many of the witnesses were to the actual deadly behaviour that the soldiers undertook. Afterwards, after Watkins' intervention, we find much more emphasis on the culpability of the protesters and their stone throwing and so on and so forth, to present a case of necessity for the soldiers to shoot. 7. Preventing witnesses from seeing soldiers. It's clear that attempts were made to find the soldier who killed James Waddicker. This again implies that the death of Waddicker was hugely controversial at the time and raised several red flags in terms of the behaviour of the soldiers. But what happened when the constable and the witnesses did attempt to identify the soldier involved? The army took various different delaying tactics, denying access to the constable and to the witness to the barracks, and hence to actually give a positive identification or naming of the soldier. This ultimately meant that when it came to the inquest verdict on the death of Waddicker, which was still hugely critical, it could only note that Waddicker was murdered by an unknown soldier.
Number 8. Redeployment of the soldiers to Portugal. The full implications of this become evident when we realise that the 60th Duke of York Rifles were relocated to Portugal quite quickly afterwards. And this clearly prevented any further interrogation of the soldier or soldiers who killed Simpson and Waddicker, and all of the others who died as a result of the hundreds of bullets that were fired that day. Number 9. Lack of criminal prosecutions for anyone at Chatterton. Although there were several arrests at Chatterton, including that, surprisingly, of the local constable, quite in error, we point out, who's mistaken for somebody else, and apprehended in a pigsty, as the evidence suggests, There were actually no criminal prosecutions of any kind of any of the protesters at Chatterton.
Number 10, the portrayal of the soldiers as disciplined in the secondary literature. The selective citation of the inquest evidence, the failure to tease out this division between before the adjournment and after the adjournment in terms of the evidence, the legal depositions that were presented as if there was nothing that could be questioned about them, because of course the legal depositions themselves were largely given by people who worked for the mill owners or indeed were the mill owners. All of this has helped to conceal the truth of the Chatterton massacre. For example, by portraying the soldiers as being disciplined and the protesters as throwing a large number of stones, accounts which were only really emphasised in the evidence that was brought before James Watkins at the inquest and in the legal depositions before William Grant, magistrate, who'd obviously read the Riot Act on the day. All of this gave much more emphasis on justifying the actions of the soldiers and the necessity to shoot and kill, whilst at the same time emphasising the potential threat of the protesters. The key thing is that the contradictory evidence within the witness statements at the inquest and the failure to have a consistent tone or narrative means that it's essential for historians to look and interrogate the nature of the inquest evidence, and this simply hasn't been done in the previous secondary literature.
So we challenge this narrative and denial of the Chatterton massacre in Rise Up, the book, in 3 ways. Firstly, we're going to closely examine the evidence in the inquest records and question it. Secondly, we're going to draw attention to the cover-up involved. And 3, by simply naming and recognising the events at Chatterton as a massacre. So I hope that between us, David and I have given you a few insights into some of the things we've discovered in the past 3.5 years of research. It hasn't been that long. Some follow-up views are being planned to discuss other aspects of our research, and of course you will also be able to find out more in the Rise Up anthology. This is the cover of the book that is forthcoming and will be published in 2026.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening.